Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first of what I hope will be a series of roundtables hosted by Sano Genetics. My name's Paul Wicks. I'm a scientific advisor at Sano. I'm a researcher, a patient, a caregiver, and generally a nerd in all these data-driven things that are of increasing interest to us these days. We're going to be going through a series of talks and discussions in just a moment, but we're aware that in these crazy times of Zoom meetings, maybe some technical issues. If you're having any trouble with the audio video content, or you want to ask some technical support, you can drop us an email at contact@sanogenetics.com, and our technical elves will hopefully be able to help get you sorted. If you're interested in sort of following any of the discussion online via Twitter or anything like that, we've got a hashtag Sano Speakers. So just as a little bit of background, if you haven't heard of Sano Genetics before, then welcome. We're an organization that is developing a patient-centric virtual biobank that is hoping to be a lot more usable and engaging to the people actually interested in taking part in research than what is out there at the moment. We also have some experience in offering interpretation of genetic testing kits, such as those available from other places. We can also give people access to kits that they can do at home through saliva samples to get access to their own genomes. And I think one of the ways in which Sano's had a really interesting opportunity is through a grant in the UK, working with Innovate UK to partner with Genomics England, which has got the world's largest whole genome sequencing initiative that you might know about, and that a couple of our speakers will be talking about in just a moment. But we've actually got a grant to help develop and prototype and do workshops and surveys, listening to participants to understand what they would want in what sort of information they could get back from being an active participant in the study. So if you want to learn more, you can visit us at sanogenetics.com. So our agenda for today, we've been very fortunate to have a great lineup of speakers who've been very kind to volunteer their time. We're going to hear, first of all, from the UK side of the Atlantic Ocean. So Jillian Hastings Ward and Rebecca Middleton both have roles with the participant panel at Genomics England, but also going to be speaking about another initiative that I think could affect a lot of us, particularly those of us interested in rare conditions. And then on that other side of the Atlantic, John Wilbanks is going to be speaking to us, and he's got a number of roles. He's Chief Commons Officer at Bionetworks, but he's also been very involved in some of the ethical and consent issues around the US All of Us database. He's also been an advisor and an expert building into Apple's research framework, so tools like ResearchKit have had some of John's special touch, and he's also published a lot on some of the data in terms of engagement of different health apps from data sets stored within Sage Bionetworks' repository system. So once we've heard from each of our speakers for about 5 or 6 minutes each, we're then going to come back to sort of a roundtable discussion with all the speakers for about 5 or 10 minutes, just to draw upon some of the themes that we've heard there. And then for the remaining part of the session, we're going to open it up to the floor to go out to you for questions and answers, which I will try and facilitate. Clearly, we may have some technical gremlins, so please bear with us, but we will try and keep the show carrying on. Just a final note, today's meeting will be recorded and live tweeted from our Sano Genetics account. If, when you're asking a question or something like that, you don't want your input to be used in that way, please just let us know. This will allow us to create summary content that we can share back with you, just as a summary of the meeting, and also for anyone that couldn't dial in. And then just finally, you can also see, if you're a Twitterati, other Twitter handles there off to the side for Jillian, Rebecca, and John. Brilliant. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then with only minor fingers crossed that we don't lose any technical gremlins, I'm going to try and hand over to Jillian, who's going to introduce herself, say a little bit about her work and advocacy. There we go. Brilliant. And I'll hand it over to you, Jillian. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's great to be here. Thank you on behalf of both Rebecca and me for the invitation to come and do this. We always love talking about patient engagement in genomics, and this was yet another opportunity to do that. So thank you very much for that. We're doing a bit of a two-parter together. First of all, Rebecca is going to tell us what's been happening within Genomics England over the last few years, initially involving the 100,000 Genomes project, and now looking beyond that also. And then I'll be talking a bit about the detailed outcomes of my own research, or my own result from the 100,000 Genomes project for my son, and what kind of precision medicine world that's led us into, and the degree of patient involvement in that, which I think is really quite exciting, and as you already mentioned, could be a model for the future. So I'm going to try and move this slide forward, and we'll see if it works, and then Rebecca, it's over to you.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation today. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you about the 100,000 Genomes participant panel, which I have been a part of with Jillian since around about spring 2016. I'm a rare disease patient. I have familial aneurysm syndrome, and it was an absolute honour to be asked to be part of the panel. The panel is made up of fellow rare disease patients and cancer patients or their carers. We're about 30 in total, and we meet around about 4 times a year, although the last couple of meetings it's been more Microsoft Teams rather than face-to-face. And we work in between those meetings as well. And if you like, we act as the advisory board, or a friendly challenger, critical friend to Genomics England. And we're here to ensure the data collected by the project is being used in our very best interests, the interests of the participants. And we work together with Genomics England to create, if you like, mutual trust in both the project, Genomics England, and of course its research library, which is where all our data is kept. We report directly to the board and to the chair, Baroness Nicola Blackwood, and since 2016 we've all been on quite a journey, and our role has expanded and our experiences have grown over time. As you know, the project was built, structured and delivered in a relatively short period of time, and because we were brought on board early in the programme, we have been really able to meet the demands of that project, which still very much is on the edge of science discovery. And the glue that has kept us all together has been this open and honest dialogue. It really has been a critical success factor in developing our relationship. We've been able to grow and learn from each other. As you'll see from the slide, you'll see how we are involved and the levels of our involvement. And we have been involved, and our members sit on the Genomics England's 3 key committees, which are the Ethics Advisory Committee, the Access Review Committee, and the GSIP board. And there you have the Discovery Forum, which is supporting the commercial team. So our voice is very much heard at the top table, and we are able to have an impact. Over the past 4 years, we've worked hard to improve the project in many ways, including the communication to participants. That includes individual results journeys, but also project milestones as well, and trying to ensure an equity of experience, if you like, and a good experience of that. And of course, we've listened to participants along the way, and we constantly do that, and we report concerns to Genomics England. We are, if you like, that live feedback loop to them. And we've also had the pleasure of contributing to national policy development initiatives, such as the new board screening programme of genomic volunteers by invitation of Genomics England, and made contributions to other national level reviews, including the Topple review, which has been independent of Genomics England. We work locally as well as nationally, so some of our members are on the local GMCs. They're like the local delivery partners of the project within the NHS. And we're busy right now supporting the establishment of the new Genomics Medicine Service within the NHS, sharing our best practice where we can, and that dialogue very much, and that work is very much ongoing today. And we've supported the project in public very much as we're doing today, talking about the project, publicising the new discoveries, and really trying to improve knowledge of genomics, its benefits, and of course its limitations as well. And through this, we believe we are really shaping how our data is being used by researchers, and we're working hard to build bridges to those researchers to ensure the right questions are asked, and supporting colleagues right now in GEL who are trying to make this happen. And of course, there have been challenges along the way, bumps in the road are inevitable, but through this honest and open dialogue, we built trust, which is mutually respected and is really been beneficial to the development of the project. And this remains the case as it now moves on to the next phase of scientific discovery and partnership. And the next slide, please. And why is it important? Well, I think it's important to note that we as a panel not only measure our outputs, but measure our outcomes. Meaningful impact is what we strive through all stages and levels of the projects, and it's great here to be recognised for this by Professor Dame Sally. And finally, the next slide for me really is the reason why we are all here, but because behind every data point there really is a face, a beautiful face, and every data point needs their data and their trust respected, but also their faces have whole people behind them with skills and life experience and professional experience that can really help clinicians and researchers to get better at what they do, so we can be heard as well as read about and our genomic sequence read. So now over to Jillian to find out more about building those bridges with researchers.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's certainly true that I think we're very proud of being able to help Genomics England set up a relationship with their wider participant population, and certainly the benefits that we've all seen so far have meant that things have been easier for participants than they might otherwise have been. We've helped them, helped Genomics England explain what they're doing in ways which are understandable to people out there, but also I think being able to shape the organisation from within almost as we've moved forward with them has been really important. So at an institutional level, we can hear that patient voices are already being heard and being listened to, and that's superb. But what if we went a step further and actively empowered patients and their relatives to lead the agenda? That's what I'd like to talk a little bit more about in my slot just now, and tell you about two organisations that I'm aware of who are actively aiming to do just that. So this is my son Sam. He's the reason I'm here in the first place. And thanks to the 100,000 Genomes project, he was diagnosed with an ultra-rare genetic disorder in 2017 when he was 3.5. He has a variant in his GRIN1 gene that's associated with epilepsy, severe sight impairment, movement disorders and intellectual disability. But he was the first NHS patient to be diagnosed with this disorder, and our geneticist, when giving us this diagnosis, also sent us 3 medical journal articles, which was the sum total of what had been published at that point about this disorder, to ask whether it sounded like him and if in fact that would be further evidence to support their tentative diagnosis. So in an instant, the balance between patient and clinician shifted away from the traditional arrangement where doctors tell you things and use it and listen and agree with them mostly, into a much more collaborative space. And that's one which has been replicated over and over again now, both in our experiences as a family, but also more widely among the rare disease community that Paul was alluding to. So fast forward to the summer of 2019, and I was one of a group of parents from Europe and North America who set up the Cure GRIN Foundation, which is aiming to bring families and researchers and doctors closer together. The aim is to drive forward research that will hopefully bring treatment and perhaps even cures to our children in due course. We're in touch with researchers and clinicians around the world, but our patient data is held in many different places, which makes detailed analysis difficult. So we need to find better ways of linking patients, data and researchers together. This is Dr. Priscilla Chan, a paediatrician and the co-founder of the Chan Zuckerberg initiative with her husband Mark. CZI is a US-based non-profit that is helping to build lasting relationships between patients, doctors and researchers, inspired by Dr. Chan's own experiences. As a young doctor, she established that science and medicine would be much better if researchers could harness the power of patients in the fight against rare disease. Dr. Chan went on to say, researchers are asking for this key resource and patients are willing to share what they know. And that's why the CZI initiative have launched the Rare as One project. Their aim is to connect patient communities with researchers and clinicians so they can work collaboratively to find cures. The Rare as One programme has three aims. Firstly, to strengthen communities, so those who are affected by an individual rare condition. Secondly, to build capacity among those communities. And thirdly, to promote collaboration between them so that lessons can be shared and learned around the world. It's supporting 30 patient-led organisations for the next 2 years with a grant of up to $450,000 US dollars per organisation for the purposes of building patient-led research networks. I'm delighted to report that the True Grin Foundation was announced as one of the 30 successful applicants earlier this year. We can now go ahead and start building our patient-led research network in earnest. We can employ staff to make connections. We can bring researchers together from all over the world at our global conference, which unfortunately due to COVID has been postponed until next year, but it's still definitely on the agenda. And we're also finding ways to make collaboration easier, potentially creating a global database of GRIN patients and gene variants, sorry, it's a tongue twister. We're already working with our own scientific advisory boards to identify and promote research priorities. And we're also networking with the 29 other recipients of Rare as One support to share tips and ideas. But we're only one of 280 organisations who applied for support from CZI, all of whom in doing so had to write a costed business plan to support research in their particular rare disease area. This degree of professionalisation of the rare disease world will generate benefits for all kinds of rare disease patients in the coming years. CZI recognise this too, and are encouraging medical and commercial researchers to build stronger relationships with patients and their representatives. And there's just two quotes there on the screen, which have been pulled from the website that they have to tell the world what they're up to. And you can see very strongly it's about emphasising the importance to the organisations who might be willing to work with patients of collaboration, as well as the benefit to patients themselves. So to conclude, I think the idea of a patient-led research network is a huge leap forward in terms of patient power. And I think it brings in a new era, not only of patient involvement along the journey of precision medicine research, but a seat at the table when the route map is drawn. And as Rebecca mentioned, the road ahead will of course be a bumpy one, but it really feels like we're all travelling on it together. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jillian and Rebecca. So what I loved about that is, so often when I hear about the 100,000 Genomes project in an international context, people really admire it. But of course, if you're a non-profit or a company or a country that doesn't happen to have the types of resources and the political will that the UK had at the time that was set up, it's actually maybe not that helpful. We can sort of say, well, exactly how does that help me? But I think you really illustrated that case for, say, a non-profit about what they can learn and apply in that case. So thank you for sharing that experience. So now it's turn to John Wilbanks, and hopefully if we can get your screen sharing up, we can learn from your experiences. And then we are getting some questions coming in on chat. Do also use the Q&A function. That's slightly more manageable for questions. And then we'll be bringing people back in in about 10 minutes. You're muted at the moment, John.
Okay, Paul, are you getting the correct version of mine?
Yes, we've got your slides. This is the, we're getting the notes for you. We're getting the notes for you as well. That's better. That's perfect. Thank you.
So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Sano. And it's a pleasure to be a part of this group. I'm coming from a very different spot. I work at a nonprofit in the United States called Sage Bionetworks. We are a 10-year-old organization that spun out of Merck, and our mandate is to explore how open science, collaborative and team science can make the claims that come out of science more reliable. And we try to do that by making the data more responsibly shareable, so people have more data to draw better conclusions. And also by trying to make the data more representative, which is to say that we actually accurately represent the populations that we're trying to model. And so we've done a lot of work in mobile research and virtual clinical studies. So I'm going to give a few examples out of the work we've done there. So one of the questions that you have to ask if you're doing anything in the mobile or virtual space is, what's your design philosophy? And this is not a question you have to ask when you're doing a regular clinical study, because you inherit this implicit design philosophy that says we're going to print things out on paper and clinical study coordinators are going to talk to people who are enrolling. But when you move to technology, right, you move to a design system. And so frequently, everyone overemphasizes all of the science and the clinical stuff, and then there's no money left to actually design what you're doing and make it usable to the actual human beings who need to use your technology. And so I'm going to use some slides that Jordan Kussman and Stockard Simon presented internally at Sage a while ago, because I think they really tell some of the story here, which is we've got things like Research Kit, and I'll talk a second about that, and Paul mentioned it in the introduction. But you don't realize how many colors you have to choose and where you have to put buttons on things and why all of your users, because you have this wonderful day when you launch a study where your enrollment goes up like this. And then 2 days later, your usage goes back down to 0 where you were when you launched the app. And so it's because when you talk to the actual users, they don't know what to click on and what to do. Everyone gets frustrated. The user gets frustrated, the researcher gets frustrated, and you don't get any good data, so you can't actually draw any inferences, so you can't help any patients. And so a design system is how we address this at Sage, which is a collection of components that are guided by standards that you can use to build applications. And so think of this like the PowerPoint template that a lot of us use to build our PowerPoints. Those are design systems that help us make better looking presentations. They encourage us, for example, not to just use text all the time, but to use pictures. And the idea is that you build atoms into molecules, into organisms, into templates, into pages, and this lets you start to design clinical study applications that are actually usable by humans in the real world. So this is what a design pattern like actually looks like. So maybe we've got an assessment like finger tapping for Parkinson's. We can literally have a picture at the top where you can have a graphic of the assessment you're asking people to do. We have the name of it. We have a small amount of text. We have a secondary link to learn more. If you've ever seen our informed consent process, you'll see the same ethos embedded here, which is don't put too much text on a screen. Let people navigate to what they want to find, right? You have an icon, a description. You have the primary action button and a secondary link like remind me later. And so this is a design system that lets us rapidly add any new module to measure something like cognition or neurodegeneration. And what this comes out of is user research. And so this is a screen from our first Empower Parkinson's app. We thought it was going to be pretty simple. Put the phone in your pocket, take 10 steps forward, 10 steps back. Well, nobody understood it. And so, these are actual comments we got, right? Not to mention, a lot of women's clothes don't have pockets on them. So we kind of screwed that one up from the beginning because we didn't do research with a representative population, which is one of the reasons why the reliability of the claims we got out of this data could be questioned. So how does design help fix this? So at the top, we have the problems we had, which are we couldn't find the button, the instructions weren't clear. Right on the right, you have the redesigned version of it from the next version of the app that uses the design system where we have an animated GIF. In our instructions, we make a point of you can hold the phone or put on clothes that have pockets before you do this, right? And it's way more inclusive, it's way more diverse of our populations, and the data we're going to get are going to be more representative and therefore more reliable. So we're trying to move towards open sourcing as many pieces of this design system as we can so that everyone can use it for free because we're a nonprofit. It's not our job to proprietize these things. This started with our work on informed consent. And so this is our most recent version of our toolkit, which is a teaching toolkit called the Elements of Informed Consent. Want to just recognize Meg Doerr at Sage and Sarah Moore, who sadly recently left us to get a promotion and move to Amazon. But the two of them have been the leads on this Elements of Informed Consent design system and toolkit, which you can find on our website. We try to syndicate this content into as many places as possible because the developers won't come to our site. They want to pull things in out of GitHub. So we have all the iconography reference implementations of the toolkit available through GitHub. That means they have been syndicated out into things like Research Kit, which again, is this Apple open source design system for the app itself. So you have the design system for sort of apps generally, which is Research Kit, Research Stack, but the design system really fits into this as a larger piece, right? So this is our overall design system at Sage. I would call out the Privacy Toolkit because this is the first big piece of it that we've actually launched and released as well. And so this is privacytoolkit.sagebase.org. If you go to that, what you see is this design system for privacy policies and privacy systems. That's Vanessa Barone from the Sage the Sage governance team, Woody McDuffie, who's now at the Gates Foundation, he and Vanessa together built this at Sage. Again, openly available. You can go in and find these curated interface patterns for things like reminding people that you're collecting passive data every couple of months, which is good taste. And again, the more fair you are, the more open you are to your participants, the better data you'll get. And this is now moving on to actual measurements like cognition. This is a variety of toolkits that are coming out that will be the same thing, but for the science. And so I just wanted to end with, this goes beyond your design into reality. And the reality is, and this is Abhi Pratap at Sage's paper, the reality is that unless you're getting a prescription to use your app or you're getting payment to use your app, so far no one has unlocked a design that actually keeps people engaged beyond their innate engagement. So we have to do better on a design process to keep people using these tools because they find value. And part of that is that they get the data back or they get some sort of non-study value back out of it. The way to get after this is you take these systems, but you've got to design for trust. Make things open, it makes things better. And you have to understand your users. And you need to do that by doing research, not by making ideas about what you think your participants want, because your assumptions are often going to be wrong. This was all very fast. So if I went too quick, hit me up on Twitter or on email, and happy to take questions later. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, John. Yeah, so, I think you guys have really been the leaders in sharing your working, right? I mean, so many organizations, including ones I've worked with, they get a little bit good at this, but that's their secret sauce. And then, they want to sort of hold on to it. I think where you guys have really been the exemplars is, sharing that information and wanting it to be used by other people, because ultimately, whatever project we're working on may fold, but that learning, if it's being shared in such a way that others can use it, will help a lot more people. So that's great. So I wanted to just have a quick sort of maybe 5-10 minute conversation just between the four of us first of all before we open up for questions. And I was sort of intrigued to maybe have a think about the degree to which this big thing that's all going on at the moment with COVID-19 has caused you to think a little bit and reflect, because now so many more of us who maybe didn't think of ourselves as patients now think of ourselves as potential patients. People who, if they don't have a chronic illness, might not be tracking their data, are suddenly tracking their coughs. And there could even be a possibility of a government mandated set of apps which get you tracking symptoms and that kind of thing. So do you think there's opportunity there? Do you think there's risk? How do you see this big pandemic affecting issues of trust, privacy, and relationships between participants and researchers?
Yeah, that's a really good one. And I think, it just highlighted to everybody the fact that apps can now collect quite a lot of information about people with or without permission. And I think suddenly we've all become experts in healthcare data and what can be done with it, or what might be done with it if the right people got the chance to see it. So it certainly brought healthcare science way up the agenda compared to where it was a year ago, which has to be a good thing. But I'm not entirely sure that the things which have so far been developed have necessarily been able to bring participant interests along in the way that you might have hoped for in an ideal world, to be honest.
Yeah, and there's some forthcoming blogs, editorials, and things like that, particularly out of the BMJ, cautioning that actually we've maybe thrown out a lot of the participant voice work that's been so crucial in chronic diseases and rare diseases, with the not entirely convincing rationale, we've got to move fast, we've got to react, we've got to let the science lead us. But then, of course, we may end up in a situation where what John was saying, if no one uses the apps and they've got Parkinson's disease, are people going to use the app when A, they might not fully believe in their government, B, might not trust how their data is being used, and C, that data could be used against them? John, you left the house twice, you're only allowed to go once or whatever. So, do we have you seen some what are the forehead slapping moments you've experienced?
Well, I think what we've seen is sort of we spend a lot of time on governance generally, not just sort of the consent side of this, but all the back-end governance. And what we see again and again is that everyone wants governance to be turnkey, like to be a product, right, as opposed to it being a process. And so I think when you're looking at things like contact tracing in the United States, like we've got, each state can have its own contact tracing app. Each of those apps may or may not use the Google and Apple Bluetooth framework. A lot of them don't want to use those Bluetooth frameworks because that means they can't collect GPS. And you have, because of sort of fog of war, you have a procurement problem where unqualified developers get contracts. And so it creates this process where we lose all trust in contact tracing generally, which is not great. It's a bad outcome. And so this gets to where, if one of the ways that we're trying to go after this at Sage is through this design system approach, is if you release tools that make it easy to build apps, and oh, by the way, you have to take out the trust parts actively. We think that's a better way to get at it, given that we don't particularly have a functional government right now. Than some other ways that we might go. In an ideal world, the federal government here would take the lead and produce the design system, and then the states could localize it. But we're just in a moment where there's just not a lot of trust by anyone in anything, and so a lot of the stuff we're seeing in the United States is unfortunately less engagement or participant centered, and it's more institution centered because that's what can actually get done. So I'm spending a lot of time on data integration out of clinical institutions of their individual level patient data on COVID than we are on actually trying to reach out to people. And so we have some stuff coming out at Sage in the next few weeks that we hope starts to get at that, to address that and say, how do we reach out to survivors of COVID? How do we reach out to people? How do we think about antibodies and those sorts of things? Because I think that's where we can start to do the meaningful engagement is looking at post-COVID and prodromal COVID by getting out through app-based studies. But right now, at least in the US, it's very health record centered because of the lack of trust.
Yeah. And of course, the challenge is, of course, people aren't going to health centers because they've been told not to. And, many of the issues that are affecting them, are symptomatic and the types of things that we self-manage. I mean, to flip it on its head for a second, I question how many of the well-known genetic registries have the engagement mechanism in place to go out and ask their sequenced participants, hey, have you had a test? So I'm a blood donor in the UK, and so I occasionally get asked for research studies, and I got told I was one of 90,000 random British citizens who's going to get asked to be tested on some regular basis because they've already got some of my blood knocking around and they have other data about me. But other than that, many of the other systems we see, they had your consent early on to get some blood from you, they get access to your medical records, but they often frequently don't have a way of getting back in touch with their participants, which maybe at the time didn't seem like such an issue, but now would have been really key, particularly when we're seeing this incredibly heterogeneous presentation where some people are asymptomatic and some people get very severe problems. So hopefully we'll close that gap.
Yeah, and I what I would say also, just going back to trust as well, and the point that perhaps there isn't a lot of trust. I think there is trust there. We've all just spent months inside because the government has said there is a scientific risk for you, please trust us. So I think there is trust there, and there is an opportunity there to get people involved, because COVID affects not just people with rare disease or cancer or somebody else, it's affecting them, their neighbours, their family. So I think this is a real moment in time when, if we can get proper patient involvement and not use the excuse, well, we need to run so we can't take anybody with us, and have some adult conversations that we can, we as a panel have supported Genomics England with their COVID study. We have given our thoughts, we have given our opinions, we've been on conference calls at 8 o'clock in the evening because they needed an answer right there. And that is fine. We don't need days, weeks, months to give an opinion. But I think it just takes some, an adult in the room to say, yes, let's do this. And if there really is an ambition to get a patient voice, then you can get a patient voice. So I think sometimes it's an excuse to say, oh, we must run fast, therefore we couldn't possibly talk to people. And that's disappointing.
Yeah, and as John was saying, the goal has to be the data set at the end, because I think people can get very excited. We launched an app, we launched an initiative, but of course, if the drop-off looks like they all do, the law of attrition, and you actually need it to be 80% of the population, then you're pretty much set up to fail from the get-go. John.
Well, and this is the risk of treating participant centricity or patient centricity as making it pretty so that people use it, as opposed to deeply engaging participants in designing the way that you collect data and the data that you collect. And it's the old saying is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
but going together means a real change, because you have to, it means that they're going to tell you things that are uncomfortable and that you don't like, that are critiques of you as a researcher, and you have to listen to them and then change. But then what you get at the end is you've actually gone together, and they'll be part of the engagement and retention with you.
Yeah. And it's scary and it's hard. And I know, from my own experience, patients like me, we used to give people access to their data and they could see it and talk to other people about it, and we'd have hundreds of thousands of people doing that. The great news is, I think that was very helpful and empowering. The bad news is we needed a whole staff of people. And I had to answer questions like, hey, what is the functional rating scale? And is the difference between a 7 and an 8 really meaningful? And how do you prove that? And, all this type of stuff. The good news is it's actually not that much work. And there are plenty of, sillier jobs out there than that. So we're going to try and do an experiment now. We're going to try and open up the floor for some Q&A. So I think we're going to potentially, for people who want to activate their screens and videos and things like that from the Q&A system. And I think in the background we'll be trying to invite people to speak. So I think the easiest thing for me to try and do, hang on, let me see if I can call upon people. My technical support has disappeared. So yeah, so I think we want to, if people could add their questions to the Q&A, which should be down at the bottom of their screen, and hopefully you'll presumably be happy to be called upon to ask a question or do more back and forth if you want to. Then we'll go and proceed that way. So we got a question here from Morris Aguilar, if I'm saying that correctly. So for these clinical study apps, how do you balance maximizing engagement, which is great for the study, but also respecting patients' autonomy? I don't know if we can open up Morris's video feed, audio feed. But maybe the panel would like to address that. So how do we balance engagement against autonomy?
I feel like John's probably the best person to answer this one, to be honest.
I try not to jump in and dominate it when I answer the last question. So, I mean, it's hard to say that there's an answer to that question. It's a great question, because you can maximize autonomy by letting everyone decide a la carte that they'll participate in some activities versus others, right? Like I'll update part of my electronic health record, but not all of it, or I won't give you my genome, or I won't do this activity A versus B. Whereas the science that comes out does better when everyone is in one box clinically, so that you get the same data from everybody, ideally. And so it's a balance that I think depends on the individual study itself. In our world, we try to do this through a couple of ways. One is that we try to do a lot of work upfront on consent, to make sure people understand what they're opting into, and if they don't like it, they can exercise autonomy by leaving. Second is, obviously you can choose not to do any study activities that you want, but we don't sort of overemphasize that in design space. We try to convince people that they should do the activities. And I think that the last one is by giving people back their data. We haven't seen a lot of evidence that giving people back their sort of accelerometer data is that useful or empowering to them, but we are starting to experiment with some things where we design the app from the beginning to give value to the participant, and then they only secondarily donate it to the study. And that's actually, I think, where the future of this goes. Is we have a psoriasis study we're looking at where ideally you would use the app and the data would never leave the phone until you got enough value out of it just as a day-to-day user of the app, that you then decided to donate the data onto the clinical study. And that flip mentally, I think, is where you actually answer this question over the long term. Is if you can't build enough value with the data never leaving the phone and going to the study, then you probably haven't done enough to respect the patient.
Yeah, that's a great insight.
Really good, really good. And I think just to add to that, it goes back to consent, and it's ensuring that door is open at every step, the level that people can leave, can vote with their feet. But ultimately, you know, it is through engagement opportunities and building trust that you take them along with you on that journey as well.
Can I ask a supplementary question in response to that, John? That if you're going to be creating apps which are of use to patients themselves and potentially could deliver information into a clinical research study of some kind, where does the funding come from that? How do you go about paying for this kind of tools to enable people to do this? I mean, it's part of a wider question about who pays for engagement as a whole, really, I think, which is something which is one that we haven't really cracked yet.
I mean, that's the question, right? I mean, in our own case, it's most of our revenues, we're a nonprofit, but everyone still has to pay the bills and pay salaries and pay Amazon costs. And so most of our funding for these kinds of tools comes from either government investment or from philanthropic and investment by patient groups. What we can do is keep lowering the price by open sourcing things. And so that's what we're trying to do is to say, what's the minimum price of such a thing? And could you get it to a point where, you know, a typical small patient association could self-fund and stand one of these things up relatively easily with just one or two programmers for a few months and still have it be well-designed, usable, legally rigorous, ethically sound, right? That's the task, but I wouldn't say that we're there yet. So because right now the money is mainly raised through crowdsourcing, which is associations, or through government investment.
Yeah, and there's something about that expertise of user interface designers and design thinkers and product managers. I mean, they're expensive people, highly sought after and in demand, and skilled practitioners of that, you know, are snapped up by the big tech firms fairly easily. And so it can be challenging to do that. I suppose one of the challenges for rare diseases in particular is, you know, there's something like 5,000 or 10,000 rare diseases out there, and many of them don't have anything in common. You know, so they vary in just how ultra rare they are, to what systems are involved, what age group are involved, the consequences, whether genetics is even relevant particularly to them or not. And so it seems difficult sometimes to get a kind of common set of elements that you can rally a data system around, which then limits the funding route or limits the types of specialists who are interested in it. But yeah, it's a hard problem. So we've got a question here from Samir Khan over in Oxford, I believe. And we're going to try and see, Samir, if you're happy to try and turn on your audio or video, if you like, so that you can pose your question yourself, because I know you're very technically literate. So let's give it a go. Hi, Samir. You're on. You're live. You're live on Radio 4 with whoever we are.
Hi everyone, great panel, and sorry I can't open my video at the moment, but it's exciting, it's fascinating both from John, Rebecca, and you all about, you know, the connection between user centricity and engagement, and, you know, the risks of it. My question was on the other end of the spectrum, which is how does all this kind of meet the real system of adoption, the kind of downstream opportunity to make, you know, to the business end of this, right? How do you who approves the sort of inroads that are being made in social media listening or in terms of open source initiatives which are non-profit driven? And I believe there's a bit of this rift in terms of opinions of those in power or those in regulatory approval systems to sort of, you know, reject a lot of this, given that it doesn't match with the typical benchmarks they use or the frameworks they use. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah. So I suppose one example we saw, didn't we, was in diabetes, where the We Are Not Waiting group who made the sort of open artificial pancreas, there's about 3,000 of them sort of hacking together their tools. That's fantastic, brilliant, you know, fantastic story to follow up on for those 3,000 people. But I suppose for me, the game changer was that industry reacted and said, we've actually sped up our plans to create sort of, you know, medical device approved, FDA regulated devices by several years because of that. And it's a great example of a smaller group, you know, the tail wagging the dog, if you like. But how do we get to the point where it's not literally guerrilla activists putting their lives at risk, possibly skirting some laws to change things? Why aren't the systems more receptive to this brilliant innovation that's out there and that's going on continuously? I mean, you know, John, you've worked with some large tech companies. do you think that there's changes happening there, or is it just going to be opportunistic, and maybe when there's more of a business opportunity, they'll go, oh yes, actually, we should be doing genomics registries, we should be doing participant engagement?
It's hard to tell, right? I think Google would love to be doing genomics registries. They've got quite a business, or Alphabet has quite a business going with Verily in the data space, right? Whether that's with the UK, with the NHS, or in the United States with the All of Us research program. Palantir is deeply involved in a lot of the data sharing stuff that's happening now, mainly because both of those companies have, good cybersecurity practices. They can meet standards. And so I think that the big thing is that the regulatory process and the approval process really likes standards and sort of, benchmarks. And if we can make engagement and meaningful engagement part of the benchmarking process that says if you don't have enough people built into this at multiple levels, then you can't apply. It's part of the gates. Then everyone will then adapt to that. But I think we have a system right now where we're still in transition, at least in the U.S. So we have some big meetings going on at the Food and Drug Administration around their modernizing their data strategy. And my hope is that we'll be able to measure engagement in multiple ways that can become part of regulatory benchmarking, because that's where the incentives are. Does engagement make it easier for me to go through the regulatory process? If so, I will do all the engagement in the world. If it doesn't, then this will always be like a fig leaf where we bring people in, and Casey Quinlan here in the United States calls it cold bagel, warm handshake is the way we treat patients most of the time. And I think we have to change the approval process to change that.
No.
From the patient perspective, though, if I knew that you were only talking to me because it made it easier for you to get your project approved, then I would begin to be a little suspicious, and it would change the nature of the conversation.
It gets at the meaningfulness of it. It gets at the meaningfulness of it. But I mean, they're mainly engaging with us because they want to sell drugs. So it's not. It's not with drug companies. It's never, in my experience, a philanthropic relationship.
Okay, but you want to sell drugs to more people, and therefore you need to find more people who could be benefiting from your drugs, and therefore you do need to be building up the patient communities. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and it's this difficult thing, isn't it, that the user interface experience of something like Uber, I think it's great. I think it's magical. Like, I press this little thing and then a car shows up and is magical, whatever. Clearly, there are many ways in which this is deeply troubling on a business model and environment and all sorts of other things. But don't you wish that trial experiences were like that from a usability point of view? That the challenge is, once we start engaging with some large organizations like this, we have to make some trade-offs. And I think the Genomics England experience is in a very unique place where, Jillian, be interested in your experience, or Rebecca, have you had questions where, with you as guardians or speakers of the patient voice, where you've had concerns about a commercial interaction or a commercial approach that's come to you and you've actually said, no, I don't think this is for us, or it's not right for our direction?
Yeah, the way that Genomics England arranges who has access to their data is through an access review committee, and as Rebecca was saying in her talk, that's something which we send participants to join. So at the moment we've got 3 participants out of a committee of about 9 people who get to have a say on anybody who's seeking to access the Genomics England dataset. And so the sort of criteria they're meant to be taking into account there are, whose best interests are being served by this. And do we trust the company who are asking for access, and how much do we know about them and their history and their ethos in order to make us confident that people like us would be happy for people like them to be seeing our data. So it's formalised in the access arrangements there.
And just to probe slightly, sorry, getting slight feedback. Would you hold the exact same thing for CureGrin, for example, where, I know what I've seen sometimes with rare disease organizations is that sometimes just the heat of the spotlight of any organization wanting to engage with them or be interested in their data is sometimes really alluring. Do you feel like you'll have the same line and hold it in the same way with CureGrin as with your role as a participant, or too soon to tell?
That's very interesting. I'd like to think personally I'd be applying the same standards to both scenarios, but I think with CureGrin it is a different setup, because you as a group of parents are very much more focused on the specific issues which are relevant to you, and you can perhaps see more directly where the benefit might lie, in which case you would be more willing to work with people who perhaps otherwise you might not have been sure about. But at this stage, it's still very early doors. It does still feel a wee bit like the Wild West. The first person that expresses interest, you go, yeah, brilliant, let's work. Let's work on something together, because at least you're interested from some extent. But we do need to maintain that level of professionalisation that I was talking about, and keep the same standards throughout. Otherwise, we would run the risk of making decisions now which may disadvantage us in the future. Because once your data is out there, you can't really get it back.
Yeah, it's which ones can you walk back? So I want to take time. There's a couple more questions here. There's one from Jennifer Vena in Canada. We're going to see if we can open up your mic if you would like to.
Oh, great. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes.
Hi.
Yes. Hi.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be part of this panel. Super interesting. I'm the PI of a cohort, longitudinal cohort study in Canada, and over the last year or so, we've actually just been building towards for a number of years a participant advisory committee, which we've now got going, and so huge value. Obviously, this is something we've always wanted to do, and I agree. If you can get feedback pretty quickly, because we were able to develop and launch a COVID survey to our participants relatively quickly, and the feedback from participants was phenomenal in helping to shape those and refine those questions. So we actually get less calls to our call center, which is better for us for resourcing. But my question was around sort of the tech capacity of participants. And historically, we were a pen and pencil sort of cohort. And we've been moving more towards online because it's obviously much less costly, easier to get data, it's cleaner, etc. But I worry about leaving people behind because the people that I know who don't have access to online or more uncomfortable tend to be more rural, lower education, lower income, and these are already populations which will have less equitable access to other things. And so we're just trying to figure out how to, what we can do to sort of bring those people along. So I was just curious if anybody had any experience with exercises in reaching out to participants like this, working to build that tech capacity and sort of bring them along.
Easy peasy. Rebecca, go on.
Yeah, certainly at Genomics England, we meet 4 times a year, but we always ensure that there is a virtual option, because we also meet in London, and the geography of that, because we're all spread across the country, has to be considered. There are people in the room with rare diseases where actually staring at a screen all day might not be great, but actually meeting in person is better. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both. It's ensuring that you offer opportunities of access through different routes and see what works for that group of people and that panel, and see how that develops over time as well. Certainly, we've, of course, with COVID, had to go to Microsoft Teams, and there has been support for that. There has been, technical support from Genomics England for people who need that additional resource, and that's been great. So I think it's just, you need to kind of look at your group of patients and kind of design something bespoke to them and their needs, and try it out different times and different methods as well to see what works. Hope that helps.
Yeah, one of the things I was interested, John, you've recently done some work on different cohorts of studies from, I think, something like 2014 to 2019. One would hope that the digital divide closes as the cost of technology and the widespread availability of internet goes down. Have you ever done any work sort of analyzing any of those trends, or is that just a fantasy of mine?
I mean, the reality is the devices, there's much less of a divide in terms of people. Do people have a phone that has basic, phone functions? But the reality is that there's an enormous variation in devices based on economics that are available. The plans that those connect to are variable in ways that can affect data transfer for things like a clinical study over time. And as you look at different populations, their comfort levels with technology are not necessarily connected to the price of those technologies. And so I think that the digital divide is real. It is something that is going to take concerted, intentional work to get over. And it starts by, again, going back to the patients and talking to them about what they need and what they want.
Yeah. And perhaps it's worth noting there's a company called
I'd love
Proteus.
to hear Jillian, and I'd love to hear Jillian on this.
Go on.
Well, I think that over the last 3 months, I think most of our parents have had to get better at using technology like this, for example. So there's a kind of intergenerational thing there where, you know, we can encourage our parents' generation to get online more easily. But I think there's definitely, you know, that level of handholding is going to be necessary for that whole cohort of people to get themselves online. And it certainly, you know, from what I understood from what Jennifer was asking about, you know, how do you reach out to new populations to get them involved and have a say in how you're designing your studies? That is still definitely going to be a big challenge.
Yeah. Sorry, we got an audio lag there. I was just going to say there's a company called Proteus that's just filed for bankruptcy, and it was worth $1.5 billion apparently quite recently, and it's predicated all around these tracking devices that you would put on your skin and had all kinds of clever data, and it'd swallow a pill. But unfortunately, the use case they first started with was schizophrenia, and the idea that, you know, you would give to people suffering from psychosis a pill and a tracking device and all the rest of it really seemed like a fundamental mismatch of what was experienced to those, what was important to those people. And that kind of operating model seems like destined to fail. So maybe this is part of the message. If you don't work with patients before, during, and after your whole thing, you should expect to fail, and therefore it is no longer a nice to have or a fig leaf. It is a core part of your operational and as key to your success as financial planning and hiring the right staff and designing the right study in the first place. Brilliant. Well, I'm just going to share one last slide and thank our speakers so much today, and also our questioners who have given us some great food for thought. If we were all together, I'm sure we'd have rapturous rounds of applause for our speakers for their time and generosity. I will be your puppet on a string to thank you and do that for you on your behalf. But other than that, thank you from all of us at Sano, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Have a good day. Thanks so much.